Before we start with the development of democracy and capitalism during the 19th century in America, we need to define these variables in order to understand the further information about each region in this continent. Capitalism, or earlier called by Adam Smith, a Scottish social philosopher and political economist, in The Wealth of Nations as the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. In social terms, it is based on the principle of individual rights. Politically talking, is the system of laissez-faire, an economy when all that is applied to the sphere of production, the result is free market and most other means of production are privately owned. Once Abraham Lincoln, U.S. President, defined democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people, but before him this term came from the Greek language and means ruled by the simple people. Democracy is a form of government based on a constitution ensuring basic human and political rights, freedom of opinion, religious liberty, and fair and free elections.
The independence of Brazil comprised a series of political events that occurred in 1821 to 1824. In Europe were the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution that affected Brazil. Because France invaded Portugal, the King John VI moved to Brazil. He did many reforms to raise Brazil to the same level as Portugal. John's son, Dom Pedro, was named regent, and in 1822, Pedro proclaimed the independence of Brazil. After the abdication, Dom Pedro left his son in 1889, Pedro II as emperor. He was deposed on the same year by a Republican General Deodoro Fonseca. The country's name became the Republic of the United States of Brazil. From 1889 to 1930s, Brazil was formally a constitutional democracy. In 1891, the first Republican Constitution was created. The presidentialism was adopted as form of government. After the Industrial Revolution in Sao Paulo, it began a period of industrialization, and the coffee production in Brazil gave the transition to capitalism. The economics and business took a new direction. They moved towards monopolies, and the technology sparked industrial growth. A lot of Italian immigrants came to Brazil and they began new business. The slavery abolition in 1888 opened the door to new works and free competence.
The ideas and practices that led to the development of the American Democratic Republic owe a debt to the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, but also the ideas of the French Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th century, with ideals like liberty, justice, and equality, strongly influenced the American revolutionaries. The two ways that democracy expanded in the 19th century were the abolition of slavery and women's suffrage. In 1800, the United States had the most liberal suffrage in the world, but still, only white men who owned property could vote. By the 1830s, most white men had the right to vote. Democracy was still far from complete, however. Voto Crusade stood out above all others because they highlighted the limits of American democracy, the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. Another process that developed democracy in the USA was the Civil War, because during this Lincoln used the Emancipation Proclamation by which enslaved African Americans in the South were declared free. It also established a stronger federal government. After the war, 3 amendments to the Constitution granted political rights to African Americans, like to vote, but some were still prevented, and women in 1920 got the right too. The United States has the strongest democracy in the world, and it's not weakened by corruption like other regions in America are. It is governed by the two-party system where there are only 2 major political parties. The American economy became predominantly capitalist only by 1900. The most commercialized sectors of the economy were staffed by enslaved workers. Then, in 1865 to 1920, economic development attains an extraordinary pace as industry and increasingly agriculture becomes subject to capitalist forces. Capitalism brought along the Industrial Revolution from 1820 to 1870 and was of great importance to the economic development of the United States. It led to investing in factories, increased production and higher demands for raw materials, worldwide trade, new inventions and new innovations, changes in transportation, agriculture and communication. After the Civil War, the U.S. grew to lead the world in industrial and agricultural production. A special combination of factors made this possible, including political stability, private property rights, and a free enterprise system. Finally, a growing network of transportation and communication technologies aided businesses in transporting resources and finished products. American economic growth in the second half of the 19th century was the fastest in its history, producing rapid rises in production, wages, and personal wealth facilitated by capitalism. Despite the rapid advances in economic growth, there was plenty to criticize and condemn. One of the most significant problems of the Gilded Age were the connections between government and business, leading to political corruption and cronyism.
Between 1973 and 1988, Chile was governed by an authoritarian military regime led by General Augusto Pinochet. Repression against opponents, mostly on the left, was harsh, and thousands were tortured or killed. A new constitution in 1980 imposed severe restrictions on political parties and placed most power in the hands of the military president. Peru Coalition, the national accord for a full transition to democracy, was the principal civil society force that used nonviolent means to press for gradual democratization and liberalization, including an end to restrictions on civil liberties and free and open elections. Democrat Patricio Aylwin assumed the office of the presidency after winning open elections held in December 1989. Since that time, Chilean democracy has consolidated and the country has become a successful political and economic model for Latin America. According to the Chilean scholars Javier Martínez and Álvaro Díaz, it is a fallacy that the return to democracy in Chile was the result of free market reforms.
In the 19th century, following Venezuela's independence, patterns of political ascendancy, downfalls, and resurgence developed. From 1829 to 1899, Venezuela had 30 presidential terms. A mere 16 presidents served a total of 28 non-transitional terms, and at least 30 insurrections occurred, albeit most of them unsuccessful. We can divide the history of Venezuela in the 19th century into the following periods. The ascendancy of José Antonio Páez. He ruled as president and dictator. He created a three-man office of foreign relations within the Ministry of Finance. The Monagas ascendancy from 1847 to 1858. They broke with the Conservative Party, but both brothers governed as liberals. José Gregorio abolished slavery in 1854, and José Tadeo abolished capital punishment. The Federalist period, from 1863 to 1870. Venezuela was a country of peripheral enclaves, defined by ports through which international commerce was carried on. These enclaves were the source of customs revenues, which, with some foreign loans, were the main fiscal resources of the Venezuelan government. The Antonio Guzmán Blanco ascendancy, from 1870 to 1887. He declared education free and obligatory for all. He built the railroad from Caracas to Valencia and tried in other ways to modernize the country. The political civility of Venezuela was principally the doing of his principal lieutenant. The civilian presidencies under Crespo ascendancy from 1887 to 1899. Under Crespo, Venezuela experienced an international crisis in what became known as the Venezuela crisis of 1895. The tradition of indirect elections through local councils will last in Venezuela until 1945.
Peru had no viable system in the 19th century. It had government by oligarchs and the military. Its history was complicated by 3 foreign wars, all of which it lost. In the War of the Pacific, since 1879 till 1883, Peru lost the nitrate-rich province of Tarapacá. That meant that the loss of nitrates and money it brings. 1840s saw a booming guano that was bread droppings exports which people bought for fertilizer. By the 1870s, the value of guano exported reached 100 million, a lot of money for Peru. The guano trade also meant foreigners and railroad building. Peru was light-hearted about foreign credit, thinking that it could borrow all it wanted and pay the debts with guano. To mine the guano, Peru imported Chinese laborers in the 19th century. The country experienced very small industrial development with a small spurt of activity in the industrial development in the 1890s. This development occurred before the country could sustain them. Castilla, the dominant figure from 1845 till 1861, tried to clean up the finances. He abolished ecclesiastical privileges. He partially abolished involuntary peonage. Those liberal measures did not break the system. Most presidents were military men. In the first 50 years of the independence, Peru had 40 revolts. The liberals created the Civilistical Party, dedicated to civilian government in the 1870s. In 1879, Peru entered the War of the Pacific, which lasted until 1884. Bolivia invoked its alliance with Peru against Chile. Almost 5 years of war ended with the loss of the department of Tarapacá and the provinces of Tacna and Arica in the Atacama region. Both countries could not determine the statutory framework. Therefore, direct negotiations between the parties led to the treaty was the Treaty of Lima in 1929, in which Arica was ceded to Chile and Tacna remained Peru. After the War of the Pacific, an extraordinary effort of rebuilding began. The government started to initiate a number of social and economic reforms in order to recover from the damage of the war. Political stability was achieved only in the early 20th century.